welcome to our Taste of Peace for May. We'll be having a conversation about fierce vulnerability, spiritual practice of healing and action. This will be a conversation between author and activist and trainer Kazu Haga and Peace Catalyst, Peace Builder, and a dear friend, spouse of mine here in Minneapolis, Liz Digitali Anderson. I like her. I think she's awesome. They're pretty great. Um, Yeah. Kazu is a trainer practitioner of nonviolence and restorative justice. He is a member of the Fierce Vulnerability Network, or member of the Ahimsa Collective, a JAM facilitator, and author of Healing Resistance, as well as his new book, which is probably why we invited him here for this, Fierce Vulnerability, where we're talking a lot about how does social action, social justice, direct action, healing from trauma, and doing that in a very embodied, community-oriented healing way. How does that show up and weave together? I'll say personally, I'm really excited to have Kazu in conversation here. Kazu's first book, Healing Resistance, was my first introduction to King and Nonviolence as like a structured thing that you could go and learn to do. And it was off of that book that I went and I got my own training, and now just finished doing a workshop in King and Nonviolence over the weekend. So I don't know whether Kazu knows this or not, but Kazu, thank you for inspiring me, pushing me on my own journey here. If you want to learn more about him or find upcoming events or sign up for his newsletter or support his work, you can visit his website at kazuhaga.com, and I have the QR code there that can take you straight there if you just want to take a picture on your phone. I'm going to leave it a moment in case anybody wants to get their phone out, but we'll also send it in the follow-up email. All right. Kazu will be in conversation with my partner Liz, who is a peace builder here in Twin Cities. Liz is a community song leader and an organizer, and uses community peacemakers, and collaborates with others for racial justice and healing. Liz really weaves together. This is where a lot of the heart of this conversation is going to go, from this perspective of how to use song and embodied practice, somatic practices, to both mobilize people for justice and build community through it, and also do trauma healing and grief work all woven together. I don't think I'm going to need to say too much more because so much is going to come out in this conversation, and I will let both Liz and Kazu say more about themselves and their work as they would like to. Yeah, off of that, I'm going to pass it over to Liz. And we'll go from there.
Cool. Thank you so much, Peter. Kazu, welcome. It's really an honor to be here with you, and to be diving into, I think really what you have is what I would say a prophetic word for these times here, where literally everything is on fire. It feels like I have to feed my children dinner. Someone else has been disappeared, right? Like I have to finish doing the laundry and something else has exploded on the other side of the world. And so I just wanted to start off by asking, like, what is one thing keeping you alive right now where it feels like things are falling apart around us?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that question. I was actually on a walk this morning with my friend Scott, who is the author of a book called How to Train a Happy Mind. And he was telling me that he was recently in a conversation with another Buddhist meditation teacher named Larry Ward, who wrote a book called America's Racial Karma. And it talks about the racism in this country. And Scott said that he asked Larry, he's like, all the racial injustice in this world today, like, what do we do about it? And his first response was, well, the first thing we need to do is notice the colors that you see around you and the shapes and notice the scents. And I think there's something really deep and wise and grounding in that. There's a beautiful quote that I've been repeating over and over recently that ironically comes from the US Navy SEALs. I wrote about in the book. It's called, they say, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I'm going to say that again. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And I know that when everything's on fire, and that everything is on fire in the world today, I notice that like I go into a state of panic and I miss the small things, right? Like I miss the sounds of the birds chirping outside of my window. I miss noticing the warmth of the sun rays behind my back. And I think it's important to remember that like the fact that the world is burning is not the only thing that is happening in our world. There are constantly things that if we slow down enough to notice it, it can keep us alive, it can keep us going, it can give us moments of joy. And I think it's really important because noticing those small things, like it doesn't change any of the fact that the world is burning, but it can orient how we relate to the fact that the world is burning. And I think that's really important because all of the next steps that we build on top of noticing the colors, noticing the sound of the bird, are built on top of a much more grounded way that we are. So yeah, what's keeping me alive is just remembering to breathe and remembering to notice all the small moments.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. There's a local elder here, Susan Raffo in Minneapolis, who just made a post that said, our brains are wired so that when we notice the bird song, right, that's another settling thing for our nervous system because it means there's a sense of safety. A tiger's probably not currently chasing you.
Yeah.
And I've just been sitting with that and had the windows open and trying to be like, all right, yeah. Um, so one of the things that has really struck me as I've been working through your book and you saying fierce vulnerability, that those two things, that this moment must be met with a fierce urgency. But if we do it in a way where that's the only thing happening, then we are not going to get to the space where we're building the world we need. And the vulnerability, to have fierceness paired with vulnerability in this moment, where the vulnerability can crack us open towards the healing. And one of the core arguments of your book is that you're saying our personal healing work has systemic ramifications, that we actually can't build the world we need if we show up with all of our personal shit unhealed because we're just going to replicate those patterns of trauma. Um, and I've been thinking about this in regard to this particular political moment in both America and in our world and saying, um, the vulnerability is hard. Like there are some things that we really avoid, right? Because the vulnerability is so hard. And I wanted to ask you, what are the conversations that we're kind of avoiding right now in that could use a dose of this fierce vulnerability, but especially on a collective level about our collective trauma? What are we just burying our heads in the sand about?
Yeah, I wonder if I could actually share a story, maybe kind of respond to that in a bit of a roundabout way.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, this is a story about I wrote about quite a bit in the book, but you know, I come from a pretty uh, my childhood had a lot of conflict, right? There was a lot of violence and a lot of abuse in my home. And for many years, because when I was 17, I had the opportunity to live in a Buddhist monastery for a year and got involved in activist work. For many years, the story that I told myself is, oh, I'm over it. Like, thank God I went to monastery. Thank God I'm involved in all this like meaningful, purposeful work. I've healed my wounds. I'm beyond it. It was a difficult thing that I went through in my childhood, but like I've healed, I've moved on. Um, and 20 years later, I was at this thing called a jam, which are these really transformative healing spaces. And I decided to talk about my childhood trauma for the first time. And again, I thought it wouldn't be that big of a deal because I've healed from that. And the moment I started to talk about it, I went into a complete state of panic and I could barely get a breath in. And I realized in that moment how delusional I was and thinking, oh, this had happened 20 years ago. I'm over it. Enough time had passed. I've healed those wounds. And the reason I'm sharing that story is because I think, you know, most of us, I'm assuming on this call, live in this nation state called the United States. The United States has this tendency to say, oh, slavery, that happened 500 years ago. We've healed those wounds. We've moved on. Genocide, we've moved on. Women have the right to vote now. That like incident, that issue has been healed. And that's not how trauma works, right? Like trauma, especially after experiencing something as traumatic as enslavement or genocide, it sticks with you. And it doesn't leave your body just because time has passed. And it gets passed on through generations and generations. And so I think when you say like, what are the conversations that we're refusing to have? Like it's easy to talk about the need to abolish ICE in this moment where so many people are getting deported. I think what's a more vulnerable conversation is the understanding that like this moment when ICE agents are deporting masses of people is built on top of other moments. And it's those earlier collective childhood wounds that give rise to this moment. And it's much easier to talk about the surface level manifestations of a much deeper wound. And it's much deeper and much more vulnerable to unpack what is America's collective trauma? What are the wounds left behind by the legacy of genocide, by the legacy of enslavement that gives rise to the injustices of this moment? And so I think, if we're talking about my own life, like it's easier to talk about, like why I have trouble supporting my partner when she's going through a difficult experience in this moment, but much harder to understand that, oh, the reason I struggle with that is because it's directly tied to my childhood trauma. And I'd rather talk about this moment now and ignore the fact that this moment is built on 44 years of trauma. And I think when we talk about social issues, it's the same thing, right? When we talk about these injustices that are happening today, it's the result of a 500-year legacy of white supremacy and capitalism and all these things. And if we don't talk about those issues, then we're not actually talking about the issue.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. And how do you even begin to approach 500 years, right? Right? Just a small unpacking, one piece at a time. And you've talked so much in the book about how like being able to grieve, being able to talk about it at all, right? Without going into a panic state, being in that window of tolerance, window of transformation, as Kai Cheng Tom says, where the work can happen. Um, and our culture seems so allergic to grief. And I'm curious what you had like. I think there are probably pieces of capitalism and white supremacy that speak to that. But you also have referenced Resmaa Menakem, who's here in the Twin Cities, and how he talks about in his book My Grandmother's Hands that there's clean pain and dirty pain, and basically, oh, just the whole way that our culture is running on dirty pain, where we avoid, and so this instinct to be like allergic to grief, to say, oh, I'm not ready to be vulnerable, or I don't need to be vulnerable. What's the cost of that?
What's the cost of it? I think every single person living in this country, probably every single person of our species, knows that there is something deeply, deeply wrong with the way we are living our lives. And the constant energy that it takes to like suppress this deep knowing, I think is exhausting. And I think the cost of that is mental health crises. The cost of that is an inability to build authentic, intimate relationships with each other. The cost of that is not even realizing how we are doing. Like, what was the last time someone asked you, how are you? And actually meant it and actually slowed down enough to give you the space to actually say, how am I doing? And if I'm actually not doing well, are you actually asking in a way that you're offering space for me to say, I'm actually not doing well and I need help right now? Right. And so I think the cost of not being able to say, I'm not okay, the cost of having to constantly say, I'm doing fine, everything's going according to plan, I can just keep going and going and going, is really, really deep. I think it leads to isolation and addiction and just like all of these mental health crises that we are facing in our society today. I think it's largely because of our inability to grieve. Like we're supposed to be like strong and pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and all that. And I think that is just such a toxic messaging.
Yeah.
And as you say, you mentioned capitalism and white supremacy, and obviously patriarchy has such deep impact in particularly male socialized people in our ability to grieve and be vulnerable, right?
Please. Yeah. Like, as somebody who's parenting kids right now, I feel like how we parent kids through that maze of like toxic messaging is
Oh.
oof, right? Like all of the alternate, like more representation of boys who can cry. Where is all that represent? Like, please.
And also, as a father raising a child now too, is like the importance of me being able to cry in front of my child. And also not even just cry, but just like I've been thinking so much lately about how my father, because of the way he was socialized, was never able to like pour love and nurturance into me. And it's really sad because it feels so natural to me and it feels so good, right? To like the nurturance is a part of all people of all genders, but that's been ripped away from so many people because of the messages of how I'm supposed to be as a man or whatever. So, it feels so cliche, but like just loving on my child feels so healing.
Yeah. Well, and I think to hang on to that and to say, actually, yeah, that is swimming upstream against a cultural narrative right now. That is what we need. And to say, I'm going to capture that and figure out how to find more of it.
Yeah.
Um, and to say, well, what then is what's the flip side, like the cost, but then what's possible, especially collectively, if we can learn to cry, if we can learn to nourish, if then what becomes possible once we figure out how to keep practicing those muscles?
Yeah. Well, when our bodies are filled with unprocessed grief, unprocessed rage, unprocessed senses of loss, and all of these things, the part of our brain that is capable of creativity, of visioning, of empathy, of understanding different, like all of that is shut off, right? And I think in this moment, particularly when everything is on fire, like you said earlier in our conversation, like we need so much creativity because I feel like a lot of the what I'm exploring in this book is like the old ways that we have been trained in how to make change is no longer applicable because the changes that are happening in our world are at such a large scale that we just need to look for new ways of creating change. I think the same ways of doing things over and over and over again are no longer effective in the depth and the type of transformation that is needed in this world right now. And so we need to be more creative than ever. And I think the part of our brain that is capable of just like out of the box thinking and creativity is shut down when we are not able to grieve, when we are not able to rage, when we are not able to release all of these strong emotions that we need to find releases for.
Yeah. This question of how we can get to that access of the imagination, to have a liberatory imagination together, I feel like is so key. And you have like this little like litany in the prelude that I just want to read where you say like, well, what if instead of chanting, we cry? This series of what if questions. Like, what if instead of holding signs with demands, we tell stories? What if instead of yelling, we sing songs? What if instead of anger, we lead with heartbreak? What if we stop trying to win and start trying to heal? What if we build a movement where nobody, even those on the quote, other side, ever think to question their sense of belonging? What if we view nonviolent action as collective trauma healing? What if instead of our goal being to shut it down, we try and open up our hearts and opportunities for healing? What if we mobilize the power needed to stop harm while cultivating the love necessary to heal it? What would it take? What if? And part of me is like, yes, yes, that is how we get access to our imagination. And then there's another part of me that's like, well, Kazu, that all sounds very nice and all, but it's totally unrealistic for the world that we live in today. Like, there are urgent, like, we need real responses. And I have this tension in my side of myself. Like, how would you respond to people who are like, well, that's nice, Kazu, but please?
Yeah, I feel that too. I sometimes am like, oh my God, what I am suggesting is so unrealistic. And at the same time, like, I mean, the part that I agree with that the most is like, we are in such an urgent time that we need to act now. Like, I totally agree with that, right? And I think, the going back to what you were just talking about, it's like, what is the cost of not asking the questions about the what if that you were just reading about? Like, what's the cost of us not moving towards connection? What is the cost of us continuing to do social change work in a way that we are here to just like shut things down and to prove that we are right, and even through quote unquote nonviolent means harness all this power so we can shove change down your throat? Like, what is the cost of that? Right. And to me, like, even movements that use like nonviolent social change methods, oftentimes we're in this worldview of we're right and they're wrong. And we are going to use so-called nonviolent tactics to harness power so that we can force change down their throats and we can win. And I really have come to this point where I believe that that binary worldview of us versus them is at the heart of what is destroying our planet, right? Because it relies on the delusion of individualism. It relies on the delusion that my liberation is not bound with their liberation, and we can just shut those people down for me to be liberated. And so, what is the cost at this moment in human history where there's so much suffering happening, where the levels of violence and destruction are so escalated? What is the cost of us deepening into this delusion that I can beat those people over there and I can win? So I think, you know, I would almost kind of reverse the question, right? Of like, what is going to happen if we keep going down this path of black, white, us versus them, right, wrong worldview? And I think it's that's a really scary path that I no longer want to go down. I want to go down a different path.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that I've been thinking about so much in this moment as I've been doing some pre-reading about how Serbia and Otpor, the nonviolent movement there, brought down Milosevic, and they would say to the police, like, your time will come to join us. Like, if we see the cops or the army as our enemy,
Yeah,
then, but it was actually the army coming to join them and be like, well, my kid's out there protesting. I'm
that's
not
right.
going to fire on this crowd. And they had left the door open to say, yeah, you're going to be welcome into this movement. And that was when the pillars started to crumble. And they had such an energy of creativity and inventiveness. So I feel like I'm doing the pre-reading there for that. Um, oh, yeah,
Yeah,
one
a
of the
lot of
things,
humor in their movement too.
yeah.
Yeah.
One of my dear nonviolent communication friends here has just suggested that we take a little moment to pause and breathe with how this might be sitting in your body, because sometimes I really do feel that tension, the tension between the fierceness and the vulnerability, and between the this is totally impractical, but that's the world I want, and that tension of, oh, can we get there fast enough? So I might just invite everybody to find your breath, to relax your shoulders, to see if you can spot something natural out your window or in your room, and to say, what's that tension feel like in my body right now? As I know the world I want to live in and the world I currently live in have a long way to be bridged in that gap. Um, and one of the things I've been thinking about, so part of our story is that I came to Minneapolis with our family here at the end of 2019. And our kids were tiny. And then there was promptly COVID lockdown, and then there was an uprising because George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis here by the police. Um, and as we have evolved from that moment, it has been so shaping. What I have been looking for is, what containers or practices do I need to help keep that bigger imagination alive? Because 2020 for me here, and I know for so many of my friends and comrades in Minneapolis, was this moment of mutual aid flourishing, of the conversation about how we keep each other safe, and the abolition of police just blowing wide open. And it has been hard to figure out how to sustain that energy and that big vision while we're looking for practical, imperfect next steps. And so hunting for like what containers or groups or practices help us to try and bridge that gap between the big vision and what do I do with my energy tomorrow?
Yeah, there's so many practices. Starting with something as simple as the breath. And I want to start with the breath, which I really appreciate you slowing us down for that, and for Pam for suggesting that. I remember years ago, I was talking to my little sister who was coming out of a really difficult court hearing, and she received some bad news. And I was talking to her on the phone, and she was talking to me at 100 miles a minute, you know, because of all this difficult stuff that she had just heard. And I asked her, "Is like, hey, could you just slow down and take one deep breath with me?" And the moment she took that breath, she started crying and tears were able to flow. And, you know, that didn't change any of the realities on the ground for her, but it did again change how she was able to orient to them. And that really matters. And I think that matters because like we have all been breathing since the moment we came out of the womb, but very few of us have actually been practicing breathing, right? And we don't realize that, like, we all know that when we're in states of panic, if we take a deep breath, we can slow ourselves down, but we don't practice breathing. And so oftentimes when we are in a state of panic and someone tells us to take a deep breath, we do this thing where sometimes people do deep breathing that sounds like this, sounds like, right? Like that's a common like way of breathing that people are trying to like calm themselves down when people take deep in breaths and then exhale really quickly. But we don't realize that the inhale is actually associated with the part of our nervous system that actually can keep us in a state of panic. And it's the deep exhale that settles our nervous system and begins to turn on the parts of our brain that is capable of creativity and connection. And so even things like practicing deep breathing and making sure you're exhaling together is a really important thing that we need to be doing in community, so that when we're in a direct action and we get activated, we can remember, oh, we've been practicing this. I know how to breathe. I mean, you're a song leader, like practicing songs before you go out into the demonstrations and singing them together as a way to keep us connected, as a way to keep us inspired. But also, like those are like more short-term things. I think long-term things like creating more spaces for collective grief tending and collective rage tending. I really think the work that the healing justice movement is doing to creating more access points to long-term trauma healing, like all of that contributes to a collective nervous system that we need to keep ourselves grounded in these urgent times.
Yeah. Yeah, and I so admire what you all have been up to with the Fierce Vulnerability Network and really crafting like a network of people who are committed to each other and to doing this work. I think the idea of strengthening our collective nervous system and having a pod or a core group of people who you're like, this is the work that I want to do with these people. I want to ask them to hold me accountable. I wonder if you just want to speak to how that has been changing and shaping you with the Fierce Vulnerability Network.
Yeah, so large parts of the Fierce Vulnerability Network has been inspired by the work of Momentum and the I Institute and all these groups that have been really thinking about the science of decentralized systems. And some of the most inspiring moments in my life have been when I've gone out into the streets and have been among 50,000 protesters, right? Like it is one of the most inspiring feelings that I've experienced. And at the same time, sometimes I feel like, well, I'm one of 50,000 people. And if the momentum of 50,000 people goes in this way, I'm just going to be taken along with that momentum. Whereas if I can see myself as one of 10 people, and I know who all of those 10 people are, and we've been practicing together, there's so much value in that. And even if 10 people within a sea of tens of thousands of people can have a deeply grounded nervous system, what would happen when the police start shooting tear gas canisters into the crowd? Like if 10 people can remain grounded in that moment, can that actually have ripple effects and impact the larger field? And so a lot of the Fierce Vulnerability Network, it's a small experiment. There's only small pockets of it. Tim, who's on the call, is running the experiment in Ventura County. But it's just like finding small groups of people where we are deepening with over years of relationship that we can start running these experiments with. Like I make it very, I think the first words in the book Fierce Vulnerability is that I have no idea what fierce vulnerability is. It's just like questions that we're asking and experiments that we're running, and we need to be with a small group of people that we can trust so that we can be in the unknown together.
Yeah. Yes. Yes to finding long-term juicy relationships to build this work here. And just to say, like, that takes time. Like, having been here now in Minneapolis, like 5 years, I feel like I've just now sort of cracked it. But oh, these are my people. This is my lane. Like, this is the network we've been weaving here. And in that, I think having a group of people dedicated to that marriage of fierceness and vulnerability, but also this like, I want my personal work to impact my systemic work, and I want my systemic work to impact my personal work. Some of the folks on this call know I've been slightly obsessed with the idea of personal and cultural and systemic work as a braid, that all of those three strands are braiding around each other for change and they impact each other. And but so often when I'm in spaces, I either find, and you've spoken to this in the book as well, that, oh, the systemic folks have no muscles, practices, interest in doing any healing kind of work. Or the healing folks, some of whom I'm singing with, they're like, well, that's great, but I'm not here to go to your protest or be involved in a deep way. And so these two like silos. And so this is why I keep working with this image of them as a braid, the personal, cultural, structural, personal, cultural, structural. Um, and what are the ways that you found that we can try and keep those silos, that we can try and help people to do the interweaving in a sustained kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, like some of my favorite kind of experiences have been when people are doing all of those things at once, right? When we are singing on the front lines of a demonstration, when ceremony leaders are grounding us with stage and prayer songs while we're facing down with the police, all of those things. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we all have our roles in movement spaces, and not everyone needs to be doing front lines work. But I think there are ways that song leaders can prepare people to be singing songs on the front lines there's groups of therapists who are starting to band together to offer like healing modalities for protesters before and after coming back from demonstrations and things like that. I really want to shout out again the INI Institute, who does these beautiful trainings on movement ecology that maps out like just the diverse array of just like the ecological diversity that is necessary for a thriving movement culture. And not all of it is on the front lines, but they've done a lot of great work to really map out how can people doing personal transformation work support people on the front lines? How can people on the front lines support people who are building alternative cultures and all of that kind of stuff? So there's a lot of great resources out there. And thanks to Liz for putting that link in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is one of the questions that I feel like I keep coming back to as someone who has found the songs as like an on-ramp or a container. Like if we don't have any other way into the grief, like the right song will be a portal for the grief, right? And not in every moment, but in a space. And we had an experiment that we did here last year on Good Friday for Palestine, where we went down to the state capitol and we held a grief ritual for Palestine on the steps of the state capitol, repenting for Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and saying to our state leaders, we want you to disinvest from these things, but also where we tore some ribbons up. We had these white and purple ribbons to represent all of the families being killed in Palestine, and we tore them up and we tied them to these trees and we sang there. And to do it in public and to do it together and to do it on the steps of the state capitol was like, oh, like something is shifting here. Is it the end of the story? No, it's maybe just the beginning of the work that needs to be done. Um, and then Good Friday came around this year, and I was like, I didn't want to be, no, I didn't want to be planning annual events for Palestine on this thing. Like the thing that we need this year is different than the thing that we need that year. But wanting to find ways to do more of that grief work in public where that personal, cultural, structural braid seems to be spiraling around itself, and to invite people into that and figuring out what the songs are that are the easiest on-ramps for everybody. Um, yeah. I'm just looking in the chat here. We have so much wounding around belonging, and it's so hard to trust that we won't get kicked out if we say, yeah. And oh, just thinking also about the ways that this us versus them thing that you've talked about shows up in how we set up our movements, but also shows up inside of our movements, and how that sense of when we are shoving people into a binary, like you're either with us or you're against us, or there's no space for nuance. I wonder if you could just speak to how flexing some of these muscles and some of these other practices, like it's an internal thing as well as an external thing in our movements.
Yeah, well, I mean, the more we are leading movements that have an external analysis that those people are out there, we are reinforcing that worldview that there is an out there, right? That there are people who don't belong. There are people who are them. And I think the more we are reinforcing that worldview, even if it's like against the people that we hate the most, then it's inevitable that it's going to seep into our movements, right? And vice versa. If we can create movement spaces where there is such a strong culture of belonging, like the more I can heal my own wounds and the more I can know that I like as a matter of universal principle, I belong. I am part of this interwoven web of humanity. I am part of this interwoven web of the universe, of the cosmos. If I can ground myself in that worldview and continue to build up the muscles and the reinforcement of that worldview, then maybe I'll feel less and less of a need to cast those people out of the web of belonging. And I think it's really like it's a lot of deep shadow work because as Pam was saying in the chat, like we all have so much wounding around belonging and not belonging. And at the same time, like I read about this in the book too, like I really come to believe that even though it feels like it's a universal wound, like I don't know that there's any human being that doesn't have that wound. At the same time, it is ultimately a delusion because I do believe that we live in an interdependent world, and that is the nature of how the universe is structured. So in reality, there is nothing outside of belonging. Like there are moments where I feel like I don't belong, but that is a delusion grounded, like based in my traumatic experiences. In reality, I can't help but belong to the rest of existence because that is the nature of our universe. And so I think the more we can create our movement spaces that are really grounded in that worldview, the more we can extend that out to the world.
Mm. This is echoing so many juicy conversations, Kazu, that I've been having with friends here about what does belonging look like and how do I know when I'm welcome, right? It's one thing to know in your brain that like, yeah, people invited me here, and it's another
Yeah.
thing to like feel that sense of hospitality and feel like people would like chase you up and be like, "Hey, we missed you," or um, I just wonder if you have anything to say like about that difference between
Yeah.
belonging and welcome and what really makes people understand, especially like we were talking about with Serbia not pouring the police, but especially when people are on the other side.
Yeah. I try to learn more and more lessons from our natural systems and our natural ecosystems. And I think about like, does a hummingbird ever question its sense of belonging? And of course they don't, right? Like they just universally know that they belong to their ecosystems. And I wonder what it is about them that gives them that like universal, like deep embodied knowing, and how it is different from like, oh, you're welcome in this community, maybe for now, but that might change later. Um, I think so much of it has to do with like, do we know each other? Do we really deeply know and see each other? And in a sense, I think this is one of those non-dual truths. Like in one sense, to really know each other takes time, right? It takes deep, trusting relationships where we've been through things together, where we've been able to like reveal all of ourselves. I can talk about my deepest shames. We can give each other feedback. We've been through conflict. We know each other. And I think it's really important to try to create that in movement spaces. And at the same time, I feel like there's a level of knowing each other that if we just strip away all of the kind of superficial identities that we put on ourselves and just see a complete stranger and know, oh, you are human. You are deeply human and you have been through the same experiences I have. You've been through the same pains. You also have wounding around belonging. I think there's like a deep knowing that we can have about all of humanity because we ourselves are human, and to like really get down to the essence of what it means to be human. And oftentimes we see someone and we don't see their humanity. We see all the labels and we see all the like the different sports teams that they cheer for or whatever it is. um, but if we can strip away all that and just see the essence of each other's humanities, then maybe we can all know each other even if we don't have these deep relationships.
Mm, yeah. And I'm just thinking, how do we ground and resource our nervous system so that like there was a giant protest at the Capitol a few weeks ago and there were counter protesters who showed up, right? And some of my friends in some of the street activist brass bands went and made a little dividing line so that the counter protesters, their messaging wouldn't be heard. But I'm just thinking, how do we resource ourselves so that the counter protesters also, right? Even if you're believing something different than me, I can look at you and be like, oh, I have some guesses as to how you got where you are. I have some empathy for how you maybe got where you are. I know that I could be in that place had I
Yeah.
had teachers, mentors, elders who
Yeah.
had me.
No, I mean, I wrote about it quite a bit in my first book, but I have a practice of regularly listening to like conservative podcasts and things like that. Because it's easier to listen to a podcast as opposed to listening to a counter protester because they're not like in my face. It's a little bit more removed. And I've learned a lot from them. I've learned a lot from like, I don't always agree with what they're saying, but like you said, it's like, oh, I can see why you believe the things that you believe. I don't agree with it, but I could see how that could happen. And I think, again, like doing these practices before you're in the heat of the moment, like coming face to face with a counter protester, I think it's so important. So even in our movement spaces, like doing activities like, here's this statement that we all in our like radical progressive social justice movement spaces disagree with. Can we try to think of scenarios where like in my life, I might have ended up believing this thing? Like can we ask questions that would engage someone who believes this thing to share about their life experiences and how they got to where they got, right? I don't know why this is coming up, but I've been thinking a lot about one of my aunts. My aunt, who used to be my favorite aunt, used to be my like cool hippie aunt, over the last 10 years has become a climate change denying Trump supporter. And she's like constantly sending me these YouTube videos that I need to watch about how the climate change is a left-wing hoax and all these things, right? And when I think about engaging with her nonviolently, because my mom and her other sisters are basically like, forget her. She's a lost cause. Don't even bother talking to her. Um, and when I think about engaging with her, you know, the legacy of nonviolence has always been about truth telling. And so the first truth that emerges in my mind is the truth that your understanding of climate science is wrong. And I believe that to be true. And at the same time, I sense that there's a deeper, more vulnerable truth that I could share with her that might sound more like, you used to be my favorite aunt, and I'm grieving the relationship that we don't have anymore. And I genuinely want to know what happened. Like, what are the shifts that happened in your life that ended up with you in this place where you're willing to sacrifice the relationships with your family, continue to hold on to these beliefs? And that's a much more vulnerable to, like, I need to do emotional preparation for me to be able to engage in that conversation. But I feel like that conversation has a much bigger potential to open things up and actually bring us back into connection, as opposed to this, like, you are wrong, which I do believe she, like, intellectually she is wrong, but like, where's that going to get me, right? And so even when we face counter protesters, like, are there questions that we could ask that have the potential to open up the possibility for a relationship, even if it's just like a seed that you plant and it doesn't get nurtured for another 10 years or whatever. But I'm wondering if there are ways that we can show up with more of our vulnerability that has that potential to open up a relationship.
This is so good, Kazu. And the thing that it's really bringing up for me right now, you know how, like in your book, you referenced that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about fractals,
Yeah.
how small is all. The book that I'm currently reading right now for my parenting life is called No Drama Discipline.
Okay.
And
I'm putting that on my list.
it's about the guys who wrote the whole brain child book, but they're like, you cannot logic your child into stopping a tantrum, right? You cannot show up and lecture them about how, but
Yeah.
the thing that you have to do is to connect. And then once you connect and everybody's nervous systems are grounded, you can redirect. But if
Yeah.
you just, and I'm just like, that is the thing also in our movements, also in our cultural work. And I think for me, like having this vision of something that's more beautiful, like the book is really helping me to zoom out and be like, what am I trying to do here? Is the goal
Mhm.
that I can say you're wrong, like you are with your aunt, or
Right.
is the goal that actually we can meet each other in this space and I can be curious? And I feel like um, actually having the spaciousness to be curious about each other is sometimes like a privilege. Sometimes it's a luxury. It means I'm not in panic, I'm not
Yeah.
shut down, and I've got people and prompts and songs or whatever to remind me to be curious. And you ask a really beautiful question towards the end of the book where you're saying like, what if our actions were not what's the impact we want to have or what's our messaging or how are we going to win, but what qualities do we
Yeah.
long to witness in our action tomorrow? And that to me speaks of this like curiosity and this imagination. I wonder if you were saying like, oh, what qualities do we want this connection and our impact to have? What qualities come to mind for you as we're thinking about these movements in the world we want to build?
Yeah, that question emerged out of an early, when the Fierce Vulnerability Network was still called the Yet to Be Named Network, and it was before I had joined the network. These group of activists, in planning an action where they were going to shut down the governor's mansion in North Carolina to stop the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, they asked this question. And they said, yeah, the qualities we long to see are connection, healing, vulnerability, right? And so what they did was they decided not to have any signs and not to do any chants. And when they shut down the governor's mansion, they sat in circle. And when the lieutenant governor came down, they kind of demanded that he sit down and listen to the story of each person in the circle as they shared vulnerably about why they were there and the fears that they had about the future of climate and all that, and brought this lieutenant governor to tears. And there was a whole other process that happened when they found out that um, one of the police officers from that department had lost their lives in the line of duty the night before, and so they did a prayer vigil, the protesters, for this officer when they got to the governor's mansion, and then offered them pizza and lunch, and some of the officers actually accepted the pizza. And when the officers were arresting these protesters at the end of the day, apparently one of them said, as he was arresting the protester, he said, "Thank you for your hospitality." like the police officer said that to the protester as he was arresting the protester, right? And so, you know, we have to play these roles of like cop and protester and all these things, but if we can really think about, we want the quality of connection, even as we shut down the governor's mansion, it is possible to design these nonviolent direct actions that like still have the power to shut down the governor's mansion, but have the potential to make connections as well.
Oof. Like, yeah, that feels earth-shattering, but also that's what I want to normalize.
Yeah.
Like, how do we build those muscles? And I am wondering, I just want to invite everybody in the chat to throw in, like, what qualities do you guys who are listening all want to see in the movements and the spaces and things that we're building as you're listening to this story? What qualities are you longing to see in the organizations that we build? Throw them in the chat and let's compile some of those things. Oh, discernment. Thank you, Aurora.
I want
Yeah,
to give a shout out to mystery too, and just like being in the mystery of this moment.
mystery of this moment. Yeah,
Yeah,
where so much we don't know. You're talking
yeah,
about curiosity, experiment, deep and active listening. Yeah, thanks,
yeah.
Eric. Curiosity, Linnea. Yeah.
Passion.
Compassion, Gurlane. Patience, Alicia. Yes,
Patience is a
my
big one,
gosh.
you know.
Yeah, what else? Yeah, playfulness, hope, joy, playfulness, humor.
Playfulness, joy,
Yes.
humor.
Gentleness. That we could go gently with each other. Humility. Yeah. The mystery of the
I'm seeing all these qualities, and I'm like, when was the last time I felt gentleness during a nonviolent direct action? You know, and what would it look like to really bring that out? I have seen it. I've definitely seen it, you know, but it's very rare, these qualities. Willing to grieve together.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful through line, y'all, to say sticking together and to be in conversation with your people about how do we hold that as the thing that we're moving towards. Yeah. Um, well, I think we're about to turn our attention soon to a Q&A here where if you all have questions for Kazu, you can start to think about what you would ask, but I might just offer a short song that we could sing together as we just process and integrate. And there's this song, sometimes we say, this song has been singing me. This is one that Jordan Mudd, who works out of Boston, wrote as they were preparing to go down to Atlanta and support Stop Cop City. Um, and um, they've offered it to the movement as a prayer, both for that and for Palestine and so many other things. So I'm just going to sing a line and you all can be on mute and you can sing it after me. But Jordan says, I send my hope. You can sing, I send my hope. I send my prayer. You can sing, I send my prayer. I send my strength to those resisting everywhere. Try that. I send my strength to those resisting everywhere. May you stand tall. May you stand tall. May you stay true. May you stay true. May you walk forward toward the work you're called to do. May you walk forward toward the work you're called to do. Let's do that one more time. I send my hope. Your turn. I send my hope. I send my prayer. I send my prayer. I send my strength to those resisting everywhere. I send my strength to those resisting everywhere. May you stand tall. May you stand tall. May you stay true. May you stay true. May you walk forward toward the work you're called to do. May you walk forward toward the work you're called to do. One more time. May you walk forward toward the work you're called to do.
Whew.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Kazu. And to invite everyone to take a moment and breathe and settle. Let this past hour of wisdom and this song seep into your bones. So we have about half an hour for a conversation and Q&A. I'd love to know what folks are thinking about, what they're wondering. Right now, the recording is still only catching Liz and Kazu. You are welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll go through and look at some of the ones that are already in there. You're welcome to raise your hand, and I can invite you to unmute and speak. If you do choose to speak out loud, then your video will be recorded. So you can either keep it on or keep it off, whatever you're comfortable with. Just, I want you to be aware that that would happen. So it's up to you. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. And you can maybe specify, are you asking Kazu? Are you asking Liz? Are you asking both? And the question may well spark a larger conversation. We'll kind of let the spirit lead where it will.
Lena already asked a really potent question in the chat. I'm wondering if that's a good place to start us off. Hi, Lena. Do you want to read that out or do you want to speak to that at all? Totally okay if you don't.
Yeah, sure. As long as you don't mind, my kid is watching cartoons in the background, so that I could come to this. Yeah, let me go back to the chat. It's been a long day, but yeah. My question was just that I really love thinking about these things, and I'm struggling mightily with trying to be curious about someone who doesn't see me as deserving of the same civil and human rights as a Black and Indigenous person, and also as a woman. And it feels like a sort of violence against my own spirit to try to create curiosity about someone who is an actual danger to me, even if that is out of their woundedness. And what I'm wrestling with is there a way in which I can still center their humanity without having to have deep understanding? Because just at a soul level, I will fundamentally never understand that hatred.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think the short answer is yes, absolutely. Absolutely, there's a way to continue to center their humanity and know that they are in some way part of this interwoven web of humanity without you having anything to do with that person, honestly. One of my dear friends, Sierra Pickett, who is a meditator and king and nonviolence trader, among other things, once said, the beloved community is a really, really big place, and someone could be all the way over there in beloved community, and they don't have to come over to my house for dinner, but they're still in beloved community, right? So I think, we also live in a culture where so many of us really struggle with boundaries. And I think boundaries, one of my friends talks about that sometimes boundaries are the thing that is necessary for you to maintain relationship with somebody. Because without those boundaries, you're just like butting your heads to a point where you just like want nothing to do with that person and you want to cast them out of humanity, cast them out of beloved community. And sometimes space and boundaries is what is necessary to remember, like, oh yeah, they are also part of this interwoven web of humanity. And right now, I just can't see that person. I just can't be with that person. So I think for all of us to honor that is a really important part of the work too. Liz, feel free to add anything to any of these questions.
I actually want to ask a question from an activist point of view. Those who are involved in organizing activism, I'd say many folks are used to seeing social movement spaces that are not embodying this well. How do you infuse it? How do you start practicing inviting other people into that if it's not already there? And maybe that's like both as a leader, but also as a white person who's trying to show up in solidarity with other people and not trying to be in charge at the same time. There are going to be people in our space who are working on that too.
I used to have this conversation with folks when we were initially starting the Fierce Vulnerability Network, and it was before that it was called the Yet to Be Named Network. Some would argue that it wasn't actually called the Yet to Be Named Network. It just described where we were, but I think it was called the Yet to Be Named Network. I think some of us maybe envision the Yet to Be Named Network to become something akin to like Extinction Rebellion, where like there would be like thousands and thousands of people waving the Yet to Be Named Network flag and wearing the t-shirts and engaging in these demonstrations. But I started to see it over time more and more as like, can we become more of a mycelial network? Where a mycelial network is like you actually can't see how big it is from the sky because it's all underground and it's just providing nutrients to all of these tall trees that you can see from the ground. And I feel like not just with the Fierce Vulnerability Network, but there is a mycelial network that is already growing, that is massive, that are having these conversations, right? That are talking about the importance of healing, the importance of belonging, the importance of remaining grounded so that we can move towards this like nuanced, complex conversation around healing that we need to have. And I think, when we kind of like look from a distance and we're only seeing the redwoods, we may not see that. But I think it's already happening, right? So I think all we need to do is to be like as small as your community might be, to continue to practice these things, to continue to invite people into them. And I think we are becoming part of a much larger mycelial network of people doing this than we know. And it may be that the culture of movements shifts so much faster than we realize because there's already small pockets of people that are providing so much nutrients to these movement spaces that speak to a lot of the conversations that we've been having.
That's beautiful, Kazu. And I think I would just add, like, if you feel really alone in this, I would say look for one co-conspirator. Look for one person who you can, if you seed them this idea and they light up, like, look for one person who you can go into these spaces with and be like, hey, could we offer a breath, a song, a zooming out, a bit of curiosity? And knowing that you're not alone makes such a huge difference to your bravery in trying to try and experiment. And to frame it up as we're experimenting wildly all the time. The abolitionists have a website called 1 Million Experiments, which shows that we're not going to get it right all the time. We're going to fail. But if you know that you're experimenting with at least one other co-conspirator becomes two. And when you find that third co-conspirator, then you're cooking.
Yeah, sure. I see a hand from Moses, but I also want to shout out Tim's comment in the chat. There's a link to the website of the Fierce Vulnerability Network where you can download some resources there too.
Moses, what's your question?
Yeah, good to be here. It's actually early in the morning here in Nigeria. This should be 1 a.m. So it's it's a great privilege to be here. And it's a great one learning. Today has been a great one. I think I have somebody also from my own community also on the group. Adeyinka is a Nigerian, more of a mentee who I'm so happy that is here. We were both at another event this evening, a Rotary event where I facilitated. And why am I sharing this? Because we're discussing healing, There's been a lot around stress, how peace builders and activists, a lot of things just come with disconnecting and reconnecting easily. And I want to also share some things around our own context here in Africa, in Nigeria, precisely when we are engaging in social mobilization against maybe oppression, against. I was part of a movement while I was the president of the Institute for Peace and Strategic Studies, University of Ibadan. And that time, we also have the NSAS movement, which is to disband the brutality of police first in Nigeria, a section of police force. I don't know if you know about it. Now, the protest was a big one for young people in Nigeria. And we were able to do some things. But while we were talking, while Kazu and Elise, I was just thinking about what we would have done better during this period, you know, because the tension was high and we were mobilizing from different part of the country, and it got to a point we couldn't really manage the situation properly. We got a lot of things done, but it got to a point that, when you are mobilizing a protest in our own context is a bit different. I think it's also almost the same thing everywhere, but you know, the second day or the third day, there is this fatigue that comes with, mobilizing. Even we that we were mobilizing people, organizing, we're getting tired. We try to use music, we try to use songs, we try to use different things, which, we use our own local songs here. And it was good at some point. But when it got to the fifth day of that protest, we couldn't really manage that fatigue further. And we had a lot of penetration and attack that was beyond us. So I think just in retrospect, I'm just trying to think through as an organizer of such movement. I just coordinated a section there at University of Ibadan, and I can see how stressful it was and how we couldn't manage the stress. And again, when it gets to that point, politicians infiltrated us. We couldn't really continue our agitation the way we used to be. So I was just thinking through it, what we would have done better. Because when it comes to such issues, we cannot really start mobilizing people to, take a deep breath. We did some few, but dealing with the crowd, I'm just trying to be a bit more practical and more contextual with our own reality here. It was not that easy. So possibly if you have ideas about how we'll have kept that momentum going in a way that the fatigue and everything will not have affected our own strength to push on. It was a good movement. We did our best. We couldn't, there was an overall, but we know that the problem still persists. We tried another one in 2024, but we couldn't really mobilize like 2020. So we know there is a change, but I'm just thinking, and the same thing also happened. People get tired easily. A lot of things happen, motivation and all that. So I would like to hear your thoughts on these things, possibly sharing experiences about the movement. I think that would help.
Yeah, thank you so much, Moses, both for the work that you're doing and also for staying up till 1 a.m. to be on this call. Really meaningful. Yeah, I feel like many of us have probably experienced similar things when we've been part of mass mobilizations that are so powerful and inspirational for the first few days, or maybe even for the first few weeks, and then it just kind of fizzles out because we're so fatigued. A couple of thoughts that I have is, movement spaces, there is a time for that sort of mass convergence where everyone converges into one demonstration. And then a lot of wisdom to know when is the time for diversions, when we like really decentralize and start doing smaller actions all throughout the country or the city that you're in. And I think those are require moving with smaller groups of people, and that might be less tiring. And I'll also share that I think that, there's a book that a lot of my friends are reading right now called Rest is Resistance. I haven't read it, but I hear it's fantastic. And I think there's like in a lot of, progressive spaces, I've never been to Nigeria, but there's this like culture of almost like masochism. Like we need to keep doing this thing until we burn ourselves out. And I think that sort of cultural shift of building movements that understand the need to rest in between is a long-term struggle. And if you wait until the mobilization happens and then you try to infuse it with that culture, in some ways it's already too late. So I think a lot of the work that we're trying to do now is what can we do in between these moments of mass mobilization so that we're changing the culture so that the next time there is a mobilization, we really see the value for taking deep breaths and taking breaks. I've been part of a lot of movements, Occupy and a lot of campaigns against in response to police shootings of unarmed Black men and things like that, where we have these like daily mass mobilizations, or we create some sort of like protest encampment, and we get so attached to the mass mobilization, to the encampment, that we like freeze in our tactics, and like we need to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. But the wisdom to say this was a really powerful mobilization, now we need to rest so we can figure out what the next thing is, I think is a really important part of skillful movement building.
Yeah.
I want to leave a moment to go back to a question that had come up before. I think Pam has a new question in the chat, but I was also coming back to Pam had asked about the protective use of force and how that factors into this earlier. Pam, if you would like to prioritize one question, I'll let you if you'd like.
What was the other one?
Earlier, you had asked about the protective use of force earlier in the conversation.
That one. I'm like, I mean, I'm thinking about Israel-Palestine right now, because the only way to stop the genocide is force right now. Like, I think, I don't know. I don't want that. But I understand. I don't see how it would work. I don't see how that would work either. I honestly don't. But when it is used, when force is used, I want it to be used in a way that still honors the humanity of the people who it's used against.
Yeah,
I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so my understanding of protective use of force is being really discerning about what is the least amount of force necessary to stop the immediate harm, right? And I think oftentimes when we think about even like violence as a response to greater violence, we don't have that discernment. We just go all in. And a couple of things I'll say to that is one of the things that I've always talked about is how there, like, violence can be very effective in keeping you alive, right? And keeping your communities alive. And I think there's value in that. I really do. And to acknowledge that one thing that violence can never do is to heal and strengthen relationships, right? So like protective use of force, or even something greater than protective use of force, armed struggle and things like that, it might be effective in temporarily keeping your community safe. But if all you do is kill a bunch of people on the other side so that in this moment you can stay safe, there's an underlying resentment that still remains, and it's only a matter of time before new violence erupts. So the question is, if you need to use protective use of force, what are you doing on the other side of that to ensure that there's the healing of relationships and that violence never erupts again? And I think, Pam, you also said something that's really important, is that, in a lot of movements that decide to use either a protective use of force or just like, again, even greater forms of violence, there's sometimes a romanticization of the violence that happens that I think is really dangerous. And what I've understood from nonviolent practitioners who have advocated for the protective use of force, it's always done with this like solemn, like, we grieve the fact that we have allowed this situation to escalate so much that we need to use this limited amount of force to protect life. And that is a terrible thing that we have to do. It is not something that we're doing because we're like strong vanguards and hurrah, we're like, right? It is not an empowering thing to have to hurt another person. And so I think to do it with that grief is really important. And just the last thing I'll say is, I don't know what it's going to take to bring peace to Israel Palestine. Obviously, that goes without saying. And I don't know what would happen if we sent 30,000 people trained in nonviolent civilian peacekeeping and 50,000 trauma healers, and all of these people into these regions, I don't know what would happen. I do know that it would be way cheaper than waging war, right? So like, if we can have the political will to try something, I think it's often like, I don't know what to do with Israel Palestine other than war, because war is the only option that's ever been offered to us. But I really do believe that, like, if we can think out of the box and imagine, like, okay, if the resources and the political will are there, then what are the alternatives that are possible? And right now, the political will is not there, but it's never going to get there if we can't at least have a vision for what we would do if the political will was there. So I really want to invite us to think about what those alternatives would be. See a couple more comments in
Yeah.
the
There
chat.
there was another question from Pam, but I want to hold off on that and invite Aurora to speak. I don't know if Aurora, if you have a new question or if that was tied to the previous one.
I have a question tied to what was just spoken about, actually. You mentioned the fetishization of violence, the lionization of violence. I am a veteran. I was in the military for about 7 years. It was a mistake I made when I was quite young. Thankfully, I got over and out of it. I was very surprised when I started joining and moving through circles of progressives, leftist circles, talking about activism and movement work and anti-capitalism. You mentioned Antifa and Black Bloc within the book and the early chapters, and I was moving through circles of that, and I was very surprised when I noticed that many of the people dressing up in Black Bloc and counter-protesting white supremacist movements actions seem to mirror a lot of the dehumanization and a lot of the things that I learned while I was in the military, and were very resistant when I mentioned how uncomfortable I was with it. While violence at times feels like a tragic tool necessary to protect my life as a trans woman, it's something that I've never walked away from happy about. And I don't understand. I'd actually asked Liz this a couple days ago. Like, I don't understand why leftists, progressives, seem to just repeat the same cycle of violent authoritarianism, prison culture, and run to it thirsty. And I was wondering if you had any insight to that, because it's disheartening. It's different than the question I had asked in the chat, but this came onto the tip of my tongue. If you're willing or able to speak to it, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. First of all, just wanting to acknowledge the courage of your arc and your journey. You know, it's a lot that sounds like you've been through. So really want to honor the work. I'll say that that part that like romanticizes violence, like I actually resonate with. There's part of me that I don't know if, you know, I talked about a lot more in my first book because I've kind of like shifted gears since then, but I used to be a huge fan of mixed martial arts. Bloodsport was my favorite movie growing up. Anyone that remembers that, with Jean-Claude Van Damme. And there's a part of me that still feels inspired by that kind of like level of violence. And there's a part of me that wonders, like, if it is part of like our conditioning and even our human nature, right? And I think it is possible to evolve as a species beyond that. If you look at our history as a species, yeah, it's true that violence has always been a part of it. And I think as a species, we are the first species to ever come to this place where we have the potential to evolve consciously, figure out the future that we want to create and move in that direction. And I'll also say that, you know, we started this conversation with Liz by saying like the world's on fire, right? And when the world is on fire, when we feel like our communities are being attacked, when there's war, when there's climate catastrophes, our minds naturally gravitate towards wanting like stability and control. And things like a black-white worldview where they are the bad guys is a very stable worldview. It's very simple to understand. And I think there's something in this moment of urgency where we're craving something stable, something simple, something that we can like hold on to that makes sense to us. I think the journey of healing and the journey of both like my own trauma healing, but the journey to like heal and go back to a time when we all recognized our dignity as a species is like healing is not simple. It is incredibly nuanced and complex. And I think we need to have a relatively grounded nervous system to be able to be okay with all of the nuances and the paradox of what healing requires. And so I think oftentimes that need for othering comes from a dysregulated nervous system and witnessing all of the violence and not knowing what to do with it. And it's triggering our own traumatic memories. And so, again, the more we can heal our own wounds and the more we can recognize, like, oh, when I witness my communities being attacked, I immediately go to this black white worldview where they're the devil and we need to beat them. Where does that come from? Like, what experiences in my life have I not resolved that it brings me all of this emotion and I immediately go to this black white worldview? Because it's not just a response to the ice raid. The ice raid is triggering an older traumatic memory for me. And the more I can become attuned to that, the more I can heal that, the more I can be with what is actually present in the moment without all of this other baggage. And then perhaps it'll be easier for me not to go to that place of demonizing and othering and celebrating beating those guys over there. So those are just some of my immediate reflections, but really grateful for that, for what you shared.
I think if we wanted to leave space for Pam's last question about is movement limited to people who have access to enough resources that they don't need to be focused on finding supper and making sure there's a place to sleep, or having experienced so much trauma that their ability to trust and connect is extremely limited. And then after that, I think we'll wrap up. Are we wrapping up with a song after that, Liz? Seems like a nice closing after this. So
Sounds great. So yeah, just real quick, there is a lot of privilege, right, in accessing movement spaces. I think there's a need for movements to think more and more creatively about how to create more access points, and also for movement activists to redefine what it means to be an activist and what it means to be in movements, and to know that being on the front lines isn't the only way to contribute and isn't the only way to be part of movements. Because at the end of the day, like the people who are too busy making suffer are the people that we need the most in some ways, right? They are some of the people who have been most directly impacted by these systems that we're trying to change. And if we don't have their voices in the leadership of these movements, then we are never going to be able to transform these systems. And so I think it is largely on movements to really think about, like in the Fierce Vulnerability Network, it hasn't come to be, but we're trying to create like a thriving internal reparations fund where there are resources in place to allow people from marginalized identities to even participate in activism in the first place. And so I think it's a both end. It's like, yes, our movements can be very exclusive, and like, no, it can't be that movements are only limited to people who have the privilege to participate. So yeah.
thank you both so much for this rich, rich conversation. I imagine many of us will be chewing on this for quite some time. How would you like to close this out, Liz?
Well, there's a song that I caught walking through the trees of Theodore Wirth Park. And I was thinking about what I want my kids to know in this moment of the tension that we're living in. And so I'm just gonna put the lyrics in. It's a very simple song, and you can sing along, and it's a zipper. So it says, "Trouble is gonna find you." We're kidding ourselves if we think that we're just gonna be insulated from trouble all the time. Trouble is gonna come. Trouble is gonna happen. We're gonna answer back in love. I'm gonna do that again, and then we're gonna say, what else is gonna find us? What else is gonna come? Trouble is gonna find you. Trouble is gonna come. Trouble is gonna happen. We're gonna answer back in love. Conflict? Conflict is gonna find you. Conflict is gonna come. Conflict is gonna happen. We're gonna answer back in love. What else do we need? You can pick the thing that you know is gonna happen. You need, sometimes it's the dishes, honestly. Sometimes it's fascism. Struggle is gonna find you. Struggle is gonna come. Struggle is gonna happen. We're gonna answer back in love. And then we can go up one and say healing. Healing is gonna find you. Healing is gonna come. Healing is gonna happen. We're gonna answer back in love. Let's answer. We're gonna answer back in love. We're gonna answer back in love.
Woo. Thank you all so much. It has been a joy to be with you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Kazu. Thank you for everyone for your questions and your participation and your feels and your thoughts. And I hope that we can all be in ongoing conversation after this.
Thank you all so much.